We would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the land of the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Voices of Wentworth kicked off when a group of us began discussing how we could help address the lack of political action on climate change. Little did we know that this was the tip of the iceberg. 6 months later, here we are. And amazing what can be done with a small group of people, a passion to demand better and a notable amount of frustration. We were definitely inspired by community groups in Warringah and Indi and decided to set up our own community group and to see what that reception might be. And so far we've had a really good reception. But when you start to unpack the lack of climate action, as I mentioned before, it genuinely is the tip of the iceberg. Underneath this lack of action are a host of other issues, such as the lack of media diversity, declining voter engagement in political issues, lack of transparency and accountability from our federal MPs, as is expected in any other field, and the lack of National Integrity Commission, which is fit for purpose. So tonight's topic, media concentration, a threat to democracy, is of great interest for many Australians. And whether you like Rudd or not, 500,000 people signing his e-petition was a really good demonstration of the growing need to surface these issues. So James has had 20 years experience in radio and television, including hosting the panel Australian Idol and the ARIA Awards, Nova Nights, Studio 10. He ran as an independent, which was fantastic in the 2016 election, against Tony Abbott, gaining almost 12% of the vote and helping a large swing against the sitting member. Thank you. James assisted in training and volunteering the 2019 Warringah campaign won by Zali. A father of 2 girls, James is passionate about the environment and child welfare and serves as Barnardo's Australia's ambassador. He's currently working as a content producer across many media platforms. Welcome to James and the panel. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, and thanks to the guys from Voices of Wentworth for organising tonight and for everyone to take the time out to be here this evening. As mentioned, I sort of got involved initially doing bits of stuff for Voices of Warringah, which was a grassroots advocacy campaign to try and understand what the key concerns of the electorate was. And then I ended up running at some stage in the 2016 election and then helping out with Zali's campaign in 2019. And up until about 3 months ago, I was living in the electorate, but I have since returned back to what is known as the dark side. I'm back on the Northern Beaches, back in Warringah, but I was really keen to help out because this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. Our panel tonight is a real treat. We've got some incredibly experienced and well-versed journalists and news advocates, and let's introduce them. And we'll probably do, I reckon, half an hour, 40 minutes with our panel, and we might open it up for about 15, 20 minutes at the end. So if you've got any questions, we'll hold them to then, and then we'll try and get through them. Lenore Taylor works for The Guardian and has done so for quite a while. She is passionate about media freedoms and is going to delve deep with us tonight on exactly what that means in this country. Emma Cowdroy is the CEO of AAP. I think maybe one of the first female CEOs of a news agency anywhere in the world.
I don't know if that's been fact-checked, but yes.
We don't do fact-checking. We do hyperbole, so let's go with that. She's been there for 20 years and is also very passionate about media activism. And Benedetta Bravini is an associate professor at the University of Sydney. She would have seen her work in The Guardian, CNBC, The Conversation, and a host of other places. She's also a media activist, so please welcome our panel tonight. Benedetta, we might start with you. You've done a lot of research around media concentration. Can you sort of set the table and talk about the landscape as it exists in Australia when it comes to media concentration?
Certainly. Thank you. So,
we've been doing a lot of research on the topic, and my expertise is precisely on comparing media systems around the world. And when I moved to Australia about 6 years ago, I was really surprised by the level of concentration of the market here. And by surprise, I mean that I've never seen anything like that. And I come from Italy, and I lived in the US, and I lived in the UK, so I went through, some incredibly relevant also scandals and histories of scandals, media scandals in the world, right? Like the Leveson Inquiry, for example, in London. And then I was really surprised to see the level of concentration that you face here in this country, because you have one company, News Corp, that owns about 60% of the newspaper market, okay? But it's not just that, then it owns also and it controls the monopolist of the subscription television service, okay? With something that reaches about 30% of Australians. But by only reaching 30% of Australians, it means that the audience ratings achieve pretty much the same market share, the same audience share of the ABC, for example. And I found this extraordinary. But it's not just that, you also have the same company that owns radio, and within the same umbrella you have, for example, Nova, but you also, which is owned by Lachlan Murdoch, and then you also have the Australian Radio Network. So what does this mean in terms of concentration? It means that you don't only have the 60%, you go much further than that in what we call, in my discipline, intermedia influence, right? So, whenever you produce content that gets produced for example, a newspaper, that content that gets into Sky News, for example, so TV channels and then radio, and then not to mention all the local newspapers and the level of concentration in local newspapers. Let's not forget that very often we're told, for example, oh, you have diversity because you have 9, for example, that is competing. But have you ever noticed that all the metropolitan cities in Australia are the only ones where you actually have 2 newspapers that compete with each other, while all the rest, you don't even have a competitor. You only have 1. Now, what does this mean? Because very often people ask me, okay, 60% of the market, and so what? Like, internationally, you have, the most relevant international organizations in the world that are all agreeing that actually you need about 5 players in a market. 5 means you have a democratic market. And this is not, only my research that states this. These are the OECD, the Council of Europe, UNESCO. So they all, enforce declarations that state you need to have, in order to have an healthy media market, you need to have at least 5 players in each market, okay? So I'm not just talking about one specific sector. I'm talking about each sector. And you really don't have this. And just the last point that for me was really astonishing when I moved here is that, we had the biggest historical media scandal in the world in 2012 in the UK. And we had Leveson that decided, to argue for a major change because simply the media system in the UK wasn't working. It wasn't working because the media were too powerful. You had News Corp that at the time controlled, do you want to know, how much they controlled? Try to guess. How much they controlled? 30%. It's half of what they're controlling here in this country. And that was the biggest media scandal. So, from a comparative political economist of the media, as I am, I cannot be but, really surprised by this. How did you reach this level of concentration? And then historically, I've been doing this report in the last 6 months, working very hard with a colleague that is here tonight, Malcolm Ward, that has been also working at the ABC for 20 years, before being a researcher at Sydney Uni. And we really had to try to see how did you reach this level. And of course, it started with the progressive deregulation. And you're not the only one. I mean, by no means, this is, you're not special with deregulation. Deregulation happened at a similar level in Europe. It happened, of course, in the US. It happened, in the UK. But the level of concentration here is extraordinary and worrisome. Thanks.
Lenore, let's go to you. talk a bit about the concentration and also maybe how that manifests in its portrayal of either politicians or particular party platforms?
I agree with Benedetta that media concentration in Australia is absolutely a problem and a problem for democracy, and I find it really heartening that there are so many people here tonight who are interested in this public policy issue. It's been a defining public policy issue in my life. It was the reason that after 33 years in the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, I moved to Guardian Australia 8 years ago, because we wanted to create some diversity. That was the whole point of what we were doing. And 8 years in, we're starting to make inroads on that. We're the 7th biggest publisher online in Australia. But that isn't a sign that media concentration can be easily overcome. We started off with a very particular set of circumstances, the backing of a global media organisation, and a philanthropic seed loan from Graham Wood, which we've now paid back, which is why we sort of got a leg up, if you like, is how we sort of catapulted ourselves or elbowed our way into the market. I think that to understand media concentration and look at it fairly, you have to look at the two or the several biggest players. So News Corp is obviously the biggest, 60%, as Benedetta said, in print, but about 30% online. But you also have to look at, as Bernadette said, how those two big companies, Nine and News, use their radio, television and other assets to kind of cross-promote. And I think actually if we're frank about it, you also need to look at how media organisations are prepared to use the influence and the power that they have. And I feel like that's where News Corp is different from Nine, the other really large player, in that they are prepared and do use their influence, use their power in different ways, in much more aggressive ways than other media organisations do. From our point of view, I think the most constructive thing that I can do, and the reason I made that jump 8 years ago, and the reason I accepted the job as editor-in-chief of The Guardian 5 years ago, is that it's by creating competition. It's slow, we're not there yet, but we're getting there. We've got, between 7 and 11 million readers a month. It's by creating more competition in the market that we can change things, because I'm sure we're going to go on to talk about various potential solutions, but all of them are very, very difficult to achieve. And I think, my day job, trying to create competition in this market, is, I think, the most useful thing that I can do and we can do to try to address this issue.
Emma, do you feel like that the use of influence that Lenore was talking about, do you think that is the biggest concern when it comes to media concentration?
Look, AAP, for anyone that doesn't know it, has obviously just gone through a year of turmoil. So nearly a year ago, the two shareholders, which ironically were Nine and News, they were the major shareholders, announced that they were going to close the Newswire. And not long after that announcement, News Corp announced that they were going to have their own wire service and that they were going to then offer that to third parties. So in terms of what I have seen, I think in terms of media diversity and where AAP fits with that, it would have taken a catastrophic situation and made it even worse if you could possibly diversity. AAP is a wholesale supplier of news. I don't know if people sort of understand where we fit in the ecosystem, but essentially we write factual, objective news, and we try and do it in a very unbiased fashion, because we then supply that to 400 outlets across Australia so that they can then use that to build their position and to build their voice on that. So the reason, so it matters that we are factual and it matters that we are objective. If we were not here, then those 400 outlets would either have had to try and do it themselves, which Lenore will tell you, for many of those smaller players, would have just not have been possible. So then they would have had no real viable option other than to go to NCA Newswire. So I don't know if that's really answered your question, but it sort of segued off what the other panellists were talking about. And I think it's, you know, in terms of media diversity, there's no better way to have a diverse media than to at least have a national newswire that is independent and that provides that factual, objective service.
Benedetta, in parts of the world where, thank you, countries have addressed this either through policy or through competition, what has worked to sort of divest that monopoly?
Well, there are a variety of possibilities, of intervention, actually. But I think that it would be almost impossible to argue that we don't need also a regulatory intervention, right? So in terms of recommendation, I would say that the first step, and it's something that has been recommended by the OECD and also by UNESCO and the Council of Europe, is that you need to have an independent media authority, which at the moment you say you do have, but I don't see it. An independent media authority, they have to issue and carry out plurality reviews every year. And we know that media markets are in constant turmoil. We know, also Emma was just, talking about that a few minutes before. So, we start with guaranteeing an independent media authority. And because of that, if you have an authority that has also the mandate to request that the media organization and all the media institutions actually publish for real, their reports, but also their stakes in each market. We start with the first step towards media transparency. That means that the public, and Voice of Wentworth, for example, will be informed about who are the owners. What does it mean that Nova is controlled by the son of Murdoch, for example? What does it mean that we have at the local newspaper level, we only have one owner, but different names? Do you know that the Courier Mail is owned by Murdoch? You probably know. Do you know that the Gold Coast Bulletin is probably owned by Murdoch? You probably don't know. So you start with this first step. And I don't think that this is something unachievable in Australia. We just demand that there is an independent authority. First step. The second step is that you start with solid policy intervention to guarantee this type of diversity. Now, anytime in international debates, especially in the US, I have to say, Australia is very similar. We talk about intervention in the market, we say, media regulation, it can't be true. You're controlling, you're interfering with media freedoms. No, you're not. If it wasn't for media regulation, you wouldn't have had at all the BBC, and you wouldn't have had the ABC, for example. It's media regulation that led you to consider that media were too important to be left only to the market. So you decided to intervene. So how do you achieve that in 2020 in times of media abundance where actually the content is always the same? It just gets pushed through social media, but the content is still the same. So if you don't have diversity in terms of content, of course, you still have the same level of concentration as well. So what you do is you intervene, and for example, you start with subsidies. You have so many examples of this in Scandinavian countries, in Holland, so you have subsidies that help local journalism, that help public interest journalism. But for real, you don't leave them just to, the global digital giants, or as I call them, the digital lords, to intervene to fund journalism. You actually really say that there is an interest of the public to intervene, and you intervene through a level of policy intervention like this. Then, the other thing that I actually would recommend, and it's something that is very hard to achieve at this level, is considering caps, considering thresholds. You had them in Australia, you had the 75% rule, you had the 2 out of 3 rule. Let's use them. Let's use the caps, because clearly the situation reached this level of media emergency because you don't have ownership regulations anymore. So let's have the courage to reintroduce these kind of caps. And also, I'm totally aware, because I've been studying this, for example, in Southern Europe, in France, for example, in Germany. Sometimes we know it's hard to deliver local news. We know it's difficult if you don't have the capacity and the resources, of a big corporation. So in those situations, let's have the same cap. And if you go beyond the cap, let's enforce public service obligation. So we say, okay, you are a bit of a monopoly, you are beyond the 25% threshold, so for the 10% more that you control, you show us that you are delivering in the interest of the public. So you show us that you deliver local news, that you deliver and you cater for those communities. So there are ways to do it. And there is an initiative that I was just made aware of last week that I find fantastic. Actually, I think it's a great idea for Australia, which is the idea of having a sort of a community-led public service platform, okay? Platform, so digital lords. Something like Google or Facebook, okay, that only delivers public interest news. So in this way, what would happen is that you don't need to go through the distribution networks, managed by super commercial global institutions like Facebook or like Google. You go and you know that you have a platform that will give you access, to public service interest content. And in this way, you guarantee diversity, because nowadays we also have this major issue of access of information. We know that we have the gatekeepers, and we know that these gatekeepers are not local, they're not even national, they are global, right? So how do you intervene? So you have an incredible number of options, I think. And I am very happy, for example, to see that in the UK, at the moment, we saw the emergence and the launch of something like 200 new local institutions, especially online, and they're starting really getting together to create this alternative platform where they can reach the public. And I think this is a great initiative. But at the same time, I also think that in terms of crisis of journalism, we need also to push the government to intervene, to fund journalism, not to just leave it to Google or to Facebook, because we know perfectly well, and I'm sure that Lenore knows perfectly well, that anytime we have to negotiate with them, they also want something back.
It feels like there is a public interest in the sense that, when Murdoch put out his petition, 500,000 people.
Right.
Sorry, Rudd put out that petition. Oh, God. You can take the boy out of the farm. 500,000 people, that's an extraordinary number of people. What do you think the chances of the government actually enacting on that petition for a Royal Commission are? And what about those propositions there? Do you think we are worth holding out any hope that the government will act in this sense?
In answer to your first question, none. Absolutely none. In answer to your second question, in an ideal world, I think it would be great if the government would intervene more to assist public interest journalism, but so long as it is in a way that doesn't risk in any way them having any kind of editorial influence. So I've always been an opponent of any kind of grant schemes or that sort of thing, because then you're immediately sort of in the situation of having to, front up to Senate estimates like the ABC does. And, while I think transparency is good, I think they are, let's face it, political exercises to scrutinise the ABC in a way that damages it. And I wouldn't want to be in that position. But there are other things that the government could do. They could zero rate the goods and services tax for us. They could introduce a research and development tax concession. They could make philanthropic grants tax deductible. There's a lot of ways that they could help public interest journalism. And I think we'll continue to lobby them, and I think the media diversity inquiry that's currently underway in the Senate may well come up with recommendations like that. In the real world, having covered politics for 30 years and watched as those caps and cross-media ownership rules and media mergers were debated over those years, in the real world, I think it's unlikely that this government is going to do anything more for the media. I think that they expended a lot of political capital on the News Media Bargaining Code, and it wouldn't have been my first option in terms of getting more funding for the media, and it didn't in any way address the concentration of media ownership question, because it's basically using competition law, so it's evening the playing field. If that's the way you're addressing things, then obviously the rewards, if you like, the money that's coming to us from Google and possibly Facebook is proportionate to the existing size of the media players. So it doesn't do anything about the concentration of ownership. but it does give us money to spend on journalism. It does do that. So even though it's not my first best option, I'm going to spend the money on journalism. And happily, because, you know, we really, you know, I think we need to get bigger in order to provide the competition that I want to provide, and we need to get bigger fast. So, you know, it's a long-winded way of saying, in an ideal world, I think there are interventions that a government could make and should make. In the real world, I don't think this government is going to have a Royal Commission. I think the Senate committee will probably make recommendations, probably for an R&D tax concession, and I don't think anything's going to happen about it.
Positive stuff. But with that in mind, were you buoyed at all, Emma, that the fact that many people got behind the petition, and that it feels like at least the issue is partly on the radar of public consciousness?
Look, I was more buoyed by the fact that AAP, for the first time, a newswire was actually included in the terms of reference in the media diversity inquiry. That was quite striking, because we've always sort of been in the shadows doing what I call the real day-to-day heavy lifting on public interest journalism. I mean, I think it's interesting talking about what the initiatives that the government could do. I mean, in my view, the simplest way to help media diversity and ensure that the 400 outlets that use us continue to be able to use us is to actually support AAP. We receive the lowest amount of government support of any newswire anywhere in the world, which is staggering when you consider how concentrated the Australian market is. So we receive $177,000 in aggregate recurrently. So that is across all state and federal governments. That compares with the like of Agence France Presse, who receive 131 million euros. It compares with the German Deutsche Presse Agentur, who receive millions of euros. It compares with the Austrians, who are in a very similar situation to us, where a major shareholder of their newswire was about to pull out, and it was going to leave the newswire in a very fragile and likely to collapse state. So the government came in with around, I'm not actually allowed to say it, but it was a significant amount of money and more than we've been asking for. So the long and the short of it is, I think that's one intervention the government could do, is to ensure that we have a sustainable newswire. And as you know, we had prosecuted the case that either we need a form of funding for a period of time, or we're very happy to sing for our supper and have the government take the service, which is what happens internationally. The other thing the government could consider is the Canadian tax model, which I think is quite clever in that it actually provides a tax rebate, so a cash rebate through the tax system for public interest journalism. So it's $13,000 per journalist, as long as that you can demonstrate that they spend over 70% of their time doing public interest journalism. And if you happen to be in Quebec, it actually rises to about $40,000 per journalist. So it helps direct it, not at the newsroom and not at the boardroom. And I think that's and it certainly would help AAP, that sort of an initiative, and it helped the Canadian press. So,
Lenore mentioned the media bargaining code. Can you talk a little bit about that, in the sense of how that will affect the landscape going forward, and whether it is what the government tries to tell us that it is a win for journalism?
Well, it wasn't a win for AAP because we're not covered by the code. So unfortunately, I think it will help the retail sector. Again, though, in proportionate to their size. So it's not going to change the media diversity equation as far as I'm concerned. It didn't help us. The government, I think, took the view that. Well, I don't actually think they thought about us when the code was being drafted, because had they thought about us, they would have come more from a copyright approach rather than a competition approach. We don't sell advertising, and we don't have a direct-to-consumer subscription model. So we basically were left out of the code. I think probably one of the only media organisations of our size in Australia that was. It remains to be seen whether it's going to do what it is supposed to do for us, which is to have the whole ecosystem become more well-funded and have money to be able to spend on journalism, and if that then enables either new entrants or it enables the existing entrants to be able to spend more money, that was the argument that was put for us.
Now, Lenore talked a bit, Benedetta, about the influence that having a concentration in the media market has on, you know, the perception. But you've been spending a lot of time on climate policy and how that concentration actually helps steer that narrative. Can you talk a little bit about that in particular?
Yeah. So I think that we see the effect of concentration on a variety of things. So, of course, you reduce the plurality of voices, right, in a country, and this is obviously detrimental for democracy. Of course, as also Lenore mentioned, you have an extreme media influence that you wouldn't have if you had only a 20% in the market. Because the problem, I mean, as you mentioned, it's News Corp that is always continuously influencing the public policy agenda of this country, and especially the communication and media policy agenda of the country, right? And why do they do that? Why can they do that? Like, we have some of the best evidence from the Leveson Inquiry. As a scholar in the field, for me, the Leveson Inquiry, the archive, is one of the most incredible we have, because we finally have evidence of what concentration really does. So you have Major, like as a former prime minister, that really says that he had Murdoch on the phone telling him that he will never support his government if he went for a thorough and, you know, European agenda. And he did, and we know what happened, right? So we have evidence of this. It's all on record, it's all public, and it's all there. So what happened with climate policy here? So we have now a history of research that's been done here that links also the content with the ownership. And we know very clearly that there was a very a conservative agenda from the Murdoch galaxy on the issue of climate. We know it because also his son, James, decided that he couldn't support News Corp anymore out of that. But we also know, and I was running a study last year about the bushfires coverage. So the bushfires coverage between December and March last year. And we decided to study 4 of the major news outlets owned by News Corp. And I couldn't believe that after losing something like 2 billion acres of land, after killing something like 1.5 billion animals, and after having 100% of climate scientists linking the bushfires to climate change, in that period of time, the Murdoch galaxy, and I'm talking about newspapers, only linked climate change to less than 30% of the coverage. Less than 30%. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it's like more often they were using the justification of arson. Sometimes they were blaming the Greens. We know that that's another frame. And and never really linking to climate change. So I thought, this is a fantastic case study. So I went to, discuss this everywhere around the world, because everybody, they couldn't really believe this, but this is precisely how concentration works. So it gives you this leverage to really dictate the public agenda of a country. It gives you the leverage to lead to also what Lina was saying now, which is it's almost impossible to consider that this government will intervene with a solid media policy to address the media emergency you are facing. Why? Because you have this corporation and there's too much leverage, too much political, economic, and ideological power. So now we know. So what do we do? Of course we know that they control media policy in this country. I mean, we have plenty of evidence already. We have a lot of scholarship on this. So how do we stop this from happening? Because, the level of climate inaction of the country is astonishing. If we didn't have The Guardian, for example, we wouldn't know, because they are the only one that wrote a story on a fantastic study that was done, results of a ranking that was done by the Climate Network, that listed Australia as the worst in the world for climate policy out of 57 countries, the worst in the world. I only learned about this because of The Guardian. But I am one of the people that have access to a good internet connection, that I'm aware that I should be reading what I should be reading, and so I'm exposed to what The Guardian has to say. But not many people around the country have the luxury I have to be exposed to this kind of coverage. 11 million, but unfortunately in the online sphere, The Guardian still ranks at the 7th place, because what you have to always know is that the online sphere is still highly dominated by the so-called legacy media. So if you look at the rankings, and if you look at the user and the user numbers online of online news, unfortunately, you still see that among the first, you have, at the moment, I checked even before coming here, like you have Newscom, news.com, that is still one of the first three, and then you have the Daily Mail. That amounts, and I calculated this, it's always 19 million together, just that. But what is really scary for me is one of the latest studies that has been done by Nielsen about what they're called the top digital media institutions in Australia, the top digital media. They calculated the reach, so the overall audience that they have, and they included Google and Facebook. And guess what? It emerges that Google and Facebook are the first two, and then it's News Corp, and then it's Nine. And you don't even see, for example, news outlets, specific news outlets, right? So, like, The Guardian is not even in the 20 digital media institutions, not even there, not even in the 20. And these are astonishing because these give you really an idea of the kind of reach that the company can have. So, on the climate policy issue, of course, unless we really try to change this kind of level of concentration of ideological power and political power in the hands of one institution, then there isn't much that we can do. One solution, I've been thinking about this, has been discussed with the Embassy of England, for example, together with the Embassy of Italy, because they are jointly going to host the COP26. And this is something that Germany is doing. So they want to blame and shame Australia on climate policy, and they've already announced that they're not going to do, deals with countries that don't have a better climate policy. So we can only hope to have pressure coming from at an international level. So,
one of the key questions to talk about tonight is the idea that media concentration can be a threat to democracy. Where do you stand on that, Lenore, knowing that if used in the direction they want to move, that certain media outlets can have severe influence on the conversation and the direction we head?
Well, as I said at the outset, I absolutely firmly believe that media concentration is a threat to democracy. I think that you need different voices in Australia, and you need voices that run a different agenda to News Corp, particularly on climate policy. And I say that as someone who covered climate policy when I was in the press gallery for about 33 years. If you could take one example, the campaign that Tony Abbott ran in 2 successive election campaigns against carbon pricing was really based almost entirely on untruths. But it became, and I was at the time trying to analyse that and explain why these were untruths. But the News Corp papers pretty much across the board would run the story of the day as, whatever, the pizza shop owner was going to be doomed because his, pizzas were going to go up by half a cent, or the butcher was going to be doomed because his power bills were going up. And it took a while to do the calculations and figure out, well, the butcher's power bills are going to go up, but if you look at his total revenue and what percentage that, it would sort of calculate out at like 1 cent on a kilo of mince, and any of his customers for whom that might make a difference would be getting compensation. But by that time, the whole show had moved down the road, and it was News Corp that was really driving that show. So that is the result of that election was the abolition of the most effective carbon policy that Australia was ever likely to have. And, I think News Corp's editorial policy had a great deal of influence over that. So I think, that is just one example of where the influence of a company and a company's policy on an issue is strong, and in my view was detrimental to Australian policy making. The question is what you do about it. I think that the online environment does have lower barriers to entry, and does mean that you can start new sites and new organisations that can challenge that narrative. And I do think we're successfully doing that, and I do think we're having an influence, for example, on the climate debate. And that's why we put so much resource into it. And I really think that is the fastest and most effective way to start to change things in Australia. You can have policy debates till they come out your ears, but if nothing changes, you haven't actually had any effect. If you put your energies into trying to shift the dial in the debate, trying to get factual information out there, I think that's the most effective way to go about it.
Emma, the likes of News Corp would counter, I guess, that all they're doing is representing the views of, the more conservative-minded reader out there. What do you say to that? And also, can I get your thoughts on the actual threat to the democratic process?
I'm hijacking this. Climate change is not a conservative, a left-right debate.
So I think again, if I bring it back to why Newswire is important, obviously, an organisation like News Corp has a position on a matter, and it's whether it's climate change or whether it's something else. It has a position, and rightly or wrongly, in the Media Diversity Inquiry, they did say that their News Corp's Newswire, because it's an internal newswire that they may offer to third parties, they said it's not independent of News Corp, so it's part of whatever News Corp's position is on matters, and they don't pretend it is. So I guess if I take what you've said and turn it to AAP, I think we say that we are essential democratic infrastructure because we write in a very factual and objective way, and we provide that, as I've said before, to 400 outlets across Australia. I think we are critical to media diversity and democracy in Australia because we enable the new entrants, we enable green shoots to be able to come up. Those organisations, they might have sold ads for the first 4 pages of their newspaper or for a number of pages on their website, but they may not have enough to fill 12 pages, and so they need national content for that, and that's where we come in. If we were not here, I do think you would see News Corps through the NCA Newswire. Their reach would extend because we supply to 170 radio stations across Australia, and who else is going to do that news for them if we weren't here? So I think you would very clearly see them going from 60% potentially to upwards of 75%.
Can I just add something to that? I just think it's interesting to think about objectivity. I argue that we are absolutely an objective news organisation. We follow the facts where they go. We start with a point of view sometimes, like climate change is a thing and it needs to have something done about it, but we follow the facts. What I was trying to say about what News Corp does some of the time, and not all of the time, sometimes their campaigns can be very effective. Like I would cite the No Jab, No Play campaign that the Daily Telly ran some years ago as a really sort of effective campaign. But on the issue of climate, they don't follow the facts, they follow an agenda, and that's where they lose objectivity, I think. And I think it's important to understand what we mean by objectivity.
When you look at overseas markets, say the States for an example, where media concentration isn't as intensive, they seem to still be a basket case in terms of the media diversity exists, yet they are as divided and as polarised as any nation on earth. How do you reconcile those two?
Well, I think in the States the great problem is that there are enormous news deserts where there's just no news organisations at all, and whatever's swilling around Facebook serves as news, and we see where that led them. I think also for a lot of organisations, the New York Times is very dominant, and so there's a few big dominant players, and then there's this kind of absence of news ecosystem across a lot of the country, and I think that's where the problems arise.
We might get to questions because we're getting closer to time. If anyone has any questions, we'll try and get to you. You might have to yell it out and we'll let me know who it's directed to and we'll go from there. Yes?
It's a question to all three of you because the ABC to me...
I don't think I've got that much cord.
The thing that's happening at the same time as the sort of de-diversification of news is the dismantling of the ABC. The SBS also to a lesser extent, but it's quite scary to think about what's going to be going ahead in terms of the funding to the ABC and how that's really crippling their ability to it. So it's really a question to the three of you about what role does the ABC play in the diversification debate, and also what can we possibly do to strengthen that?
And I think the ABC is absolutely critical. Online, it shares that top spot with news.com. Some months it's ABC on top, and sometimes it's news.com on top. I think that they are hugely influential, and they're doing a great job. And obviously, the funding squeeze keeps happening, and the friends of the ABC, and they sort of fight back. But no, I don't think we should. I don't think we should underestimate the influence that the ABC has, and long may they have it.
Well, the ABC is one of our customers, as is SBS, so I very much want them to be well funded for a very long time. SBS, it's probably not widely known that SBS, 80% of their online content comes from AAP, so...
So yeah, it's absolutely terrifying to see the funding cuts that the ABC has witnessed in the last years. I have to say that from an international perspective, you see that public service media have been under attack for quite some time. But I think that we can only compare the attacks to the ABC to what happened, for example, in France before their public service broadcaster was privatized. And and I don't want to share this bad news, but it's a very progressive action that they normally take. Super normally governments that want to leave just the market to deliver, and they don't want any kind of public service intervention. And what they do is they start to delegitimize. So see if that can happen in Australia. So I'm just telling you what happens according, So they start to delegitimize the public service institution, and they do that by showing, for example, that they're biased. You can see this almost every day in what's happening in Australia. Then the second thing is they start to say that there is no money and we are in debt and we have, for example, a crisis like the coronavirus crisis, and then you start justifying that you don't really have enough money. And how do you achieve that? To actually guarantee that there is always funds for public service media. You don't have the arrangement that you have in France, that you had to an extent in Spain, and very clear, and it's very clear here in Australia. So you don't leave the government of the day to decide how to fund your public service broadcaster. You have an arrangement that is much more complicated than that. It's called, for example, the license fee. So you don't leave direct state fund to decide how you fund your public service broadcaster. And this is actually in a study that I've done on 5 different public service media in Europe. The most successful were, of course, the one that had this kind of arrangement. So they were protecting the public service funds from the super conservative government of the day, basically. And this is what you should be doing. But of course, that entails political willingness, of course. And we know that it's difficult. But at the same time, an interesting, fantastic, in my view, funding about the presence of public service media in media markets showed that the level of awareness and knowledge and literacy of public opinion in Europe and in countries where there is a public media is uncomparable with the US market where there isn't. So there is a clear connection there between having a public service media in a country and not having one in terms of political awareness and public engagement. So, it needs to be protected.
Okay, so full disclosure, I'm about to ask my boss a question. I'm interested in hearing the panel's view about regional media. We've seen this week a report that the regional media companies are looking at or have been discussing some sort of merger between them. These are the 3 TV networks. We've seen the government try and encourage grants to regional media, but at the same time we've seen heaps of regional papers closed during COVID. So I'd be interested in the panel's view about what we need to do, because I'm sort of worried that we're going to have half of Australia that's living in what you called a media desert, and we're very focused on the cities. What if we end up with a community that has no real media content on their local communities and on what's happening in the world?
So I think it's an absolute problem. I think regional media closed, more regional mastheads closed than any other kind of masthead during COVID. There are many regional towns that already have absolutely no media at all. The regional television stations are already hubbed out of centres. They're not really local anymore. And as Anne says, they're looking at merging. Even the bigger print organisations are all hubbed, so it's not really regional at all. The only silver lining is that there are starting to be some new community startup media companies around regional Australia, and the thing I'd really like to do is to try to form a kind of network like we've done across the Pacific, where we've got an editor in Sydney and a whole lot of sort of Indigenous Pacific journalists who write about the Pacific for us, and independent media organisations. I'd really like to try and do that with regional Australia as some sort of small contribution to bringing regional news to our readers and to also bringing our news into the regions. I think Emma will probably talk about how AAP services the regional media that's still there, and that is absolutely true and great, but I think we've got to find new ways to encourage regional startups, or we're going to be in a situation like the United States has found themselves in, and I think that has really bad consequences. The stuff that breeds when there isn't factual information there is, not a good thing.
Yeah, so I mean, AAP, as most people may be aware, is very a critical source of news to the region. So we supply, of the 400 outlets that we supply to, over 250 are in regional Australia. I'm heartened. I mean, look, yes, I agree. There is. I mean, I certainly know from our own perspective that this business was acquired by a group of 35 fantastic philanthropists 7 months ago, but we were faced immediately with a real crisis because a number of our customers had the sale was announced and then the customers closed. So, we had immediate sort of downward pressure on our revenues, which was quite public last September. But and we've tried to help our customers by giving them as discounted rates as we possibly can. I'm heartened, though, that we, over the last few weeks and months, are now being approached by green shoot outlets. So we've been approached by one that wants to start up 6 new websites across regional Australia. We're now supplying to the Warwick Daily Journal and the Sunshine Coast, I think it's called the Sunshine Coast News. So they're new sites that are emerging that are reporting primarily on local and regional issues, but are leaving the national news to us. So I think there's a sad tale, and I mean where's she gone? Oh, to your point. I mean the president of Microsoft appeared at the US antitrust inquiry. I don't know if anyone saw his statement. It was quite compelling. But he did mention that in the US, 70 counties do not have a single newspaper or any news source at all in the US. And, the news deserts in Australia are defined as a place where there's no other source other than the ABC. So I think that, we have the ABC providing some coverage, but it's certainly not enough.
Well, and certainly at the regional level, you have some states, and I'm looking, for example, at South Australia and Queensland, where you only basically have one provider. Again, the level of concentration astonishing. And I was reading the report of the ACCC, and when I looked at it, and I saw that 160 newspapers closed between 2010 and 2018, and about 20% less, and that was up until 2018, so not even to include what's been happening during COVID and in the last 2 years, is of course shocking. So what do we do? This is always the question, for us also as media reformers. It's like the best, I think, one of the greatest opportunity is we have the media diversity inquiry. Now we know, and I agree that that it's going to be very difficult to change the politics of this government, but we could at least demand, as a sort of a local media emergency intervention, that they start funding, for example, at least at the local level. And they could do that, they mention all these kind of subsidies, tax breaks and all of that, and trying really to support For example, different kind of local news outlets, not only commercially based, but also, for example, cooperatives. And we've been arguing about this at the local level, community-based newspapers. And we also have the access to online, media that can really help. And in fact, we are developing a report on media concentration and media ownership. This is going to be made public, we think, with Michael Ward in the next 2 weeks. And there we were trying to understand what's really going on at the local level. And it's not easy because there is no media transparency. So you really have to call them up and see if they're still open or not. Because sometimes they don't even have a website anymore. Sometimes they closed all, the offline activities and they only went online. So this is really a situation of news desert as well. So it's not just the US, it's already Australia. So you demand intervention at the local level with public intervention, with funds, but also, for example, you start creating what she was mentioning, like this kind of networks that will bring local and community networks together, and also, in my view, launch this platform that will, in my view, like bring together, for example, 200 small titles of local news. And so we know that if we access them also online, we'll know that we are in a space where we can trust this kind of content. This initiative that has been launched in the UK, I find it very interesting because in order for the local community newspapers to be accepted in the platform, you need to show that you have a code of ethics and you need to show that you are part of the union. And so this is a way also to vet, to achieve, some kind of, I think, ethical benchmark. So I think that there are ways, I always think that there are ways, but we need to act now. We can't just let the media diversity inquiry go wasted like this. Have you noticed that no one talks about it except for us tonight? Nobody talks about it. Have you heard about Facebook lately? I'm sure you did. Why? Because actually there was a clear interest, by, again, one of the major, news institutions to lead the debate at the global level on Facebook and the government fight against Facebook. And that was at the time in which you had the former Prime Minister discussing and being testifying at the Media Diversity Inquiry. Shocking. So, we can't really miss this opportunity. I think it's the greatest chance also to be having your voice heard.
Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more. Do you want to ask a question over here?
Thank you so much. Very quick, 2 questions. 2012, 2013, forget the year, Julia Gillard tried to put in media reform and it got nowhere. Is that because it was badly thought out reform, or did the big boys mobilise to beat it? So just a quick yes, no on all of that. Secondly, policy intervention, political willingness. As somebody who's currently training 2,000 women to run by 2022, if you don't think the current faces are going to implement the policy, what is it going to take? Who are the faces that are going to do that?
Right, great question.
On the first one, yes, it was that it was nobbled, yes. On the second one, it's interesting what is going to change. I actually, and I'm probably playing to the crowd here, but it's what I really think, that if there are smart, well-meaning independents in the balance of power positions in the lower house in particular, but in both houses, who will be less beholden and less fearful of media backlash, then you've got a better chance of better policy outcomes. And I think the Gillard government is an example of that. I think that was what happened in the Gillard government. So it's not so, all power to your hand, more women in parliament, fantastic. But actually in this instance, I think it's to have parliament. I really think that the institutions of the political parties and the way that they think, the way that they view politics, is the biggest impediment to big structural change like what we're talking about.
Well, I mean, I don't think you have the experts here on this topic, and I've read about Gilliard, of course, and I know that she was obviously also highly bullied, in what she was trying to achieve. That would be fantastic, of course. I mean, the way they can actually, I think that actually starting with a new independent media platform would be a very good starting point, because you really need also a new voice. So why don't you try really to get all these women together, and then try to organize alliances also with you, Leonor, with you, Emma, trying to get their voice heard, because we need to break this monopoly, right? And so we need to try to do that from the bottom up. And so we have this great opportunity. We also have access to online, and then we can and start also by participating at the media diversity inquiry. I'm not sure that there will be a royal commission. Everybody, and they are much more experts than me in this, in this sector for sure. Everybody says that there will not be a royal commission, and it's a great pity, because the royal commission would have had the power to ask all these companies to really give us, the details and the data that we don't have, and show us. And then, so why don't you start a platform in an organized network of women, a media platform?
Emma, do you want to talk about the faces? Okay, one last question. Yes, mate, up the back, sure.
Such an interesting night. I talk a fair bit to right-wing nutjobs that just look at me, they think I'm one of their brethren. And one of the things I think, particularly with the ABC, when I get a sort of earful about how horribly biased the ABC is, I'll say, well, they are independently assessed for bias and accuracy, and they have to issue retractions and all those sorts of things. So, to the extent that your favoured news organisations aren't, why don't we actually apply the same standards? And thinking about, a grassroots organisation, I also think, is that sort of the end that we should be prosecuting in a way? Because it is, when I talk to my right-wing nutjob brethren, nothing seems to be pisses them off more, because they don't really have a logical response to it. When I say, okay, well, let's just apply what is applied to the ABC to all the other news organisations. They're using they're broadcasting, they're using our airwaves, they're public airwaves, they don't own the airwaves, they broadcast through the airwaves, and really what is delivered at the end of the airwaves should be just as accurate as the ABC. So, I think the whole thing about holding the ABC to account for bias and accuracy and issuing retractions and all those sorts of things were intended to hobble the ABC. I don't think they've hobbled the ABC at all. But it certainly would hobble all the other media organisations, and I think it would be a very reasonable thing for multiple grassroots organisations to turn around and say, hey, why is it that the ABC is the only one that's held to account for accuracy and bias and all those sorts of things? If you're going to broadcast on public airwaves, how about you're held to the same account, and there's financial penalties if you're not held to the same account? So I'm really looking for some angle that grassroots organisations can adopt that becomes very reasonable, that people will really struggle to remonstrate with. So anyway, I think particularly with your data, that might be something to comment on.
That was similar to a question. It had a lot of elements of a question. Do you guys want to comment on that?
I don't think you need to do that much work. There is actually a broadcasting standards administered by ACMA, but not many people complain to them. And it doesn't have very many teeth. It's not hugely powerful, but it is time consuming and embarrassing to broadcasters if complaints are upheld. Similarly, the Press Council for most of the print media, or if you want to complain about us, we have a very independent and fierce complaints process run by our readers editor in London. But, you know, to your point about the media organisations that you're talking about, it always sort of astounds me that some of the more outlandish things that are said or broadcast aren't complained about more, and you wouldn't have to set up a regulator, there's already one there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yes, ACMA, the Press Council, I mean, AOP has been historically a member of the Press Council, and many people have views about whether that's a toothless tiger or not, but I know for our own internal, we have a standards committee which is, you know, it's removed from the editorial board, which will look at any complaints that our content receives, which is not very many because we're independent and objective and fact-based, but we still have we have a mechanism, and also obviously our journalists have a code of conduct that they have to comply with.
Well, I know very well, because I was told off the record that at the moment ACMA acts like a department of media for the government. So it means that they're not an independent authority. And what this means is that they don't have any interest in publicize that there could be a way for you as the public to actually file a complaint. So there is no interest to actually make this and raise this public awareness in Australia, because it's really not independent at the moment. So again, you need, and it's called, again, I'm afraid it's called media regulation. You need to intervene and try to change things. You have all these tools already there. The Press Council, okay, it doesn't really work well. Why? Because, you know, we know who dominates it. The News Corp, of course. So the ACMA is controlled by the government. So what do? You need to just ask and demand that code of ethics are, of course, adopted, but you also need to see that you have an independent authority that checks that these controls are actually carried out, and they're not. This is why, actually, when I think in terms of recommendation, intervening on ACMA is really the first step.
We're pretty much out of time, guys, I'm afraid, but maybe these guys might hang around for 5-10 minutes if you want to pick their brains at any stage. Thank you for your attendance tonight, and thanks to the guys from Voices of Wentworth for organising it. If you want to find out more about what they're doing, get involved. There's t-shirts for sale, and you can go to the website as well, voicesofwentworth.org, to find out how to get involved. On a more personal level, I mean, when I was living in DY in the Northern Beaches in 2015, and at that stage Tony Abbott had an insurmountable lead. It was the bluest of blue ribbon seats, but slowly a grassroots community campaign built, organised and activated and created change in that electorate, and that is an example, as what happened in Indi as well, of what can happen when networks start talking to each other, expressing what they feel is important to the community, and also on top of that, believing what's possible and believing change can happen. And I think that's what these guys are doing really effectively. So it's not always at the pace that we would like, but sometimes patience is a necessary virtue in creating change. So get involved with those guys and know and believe that it is possible and can happen. And as I said, please thank our panel tonight for their time and their effort. Benedetta, Emma and Lenore. Really appreciate it. Thank you guys.